Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. Today, I am joined by Joseph Lawal. Joseph, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
And Emerson Green. Emerson, how you doing?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to have you on. Hey, all right. So first of all, just Joseph, just because I have the two guests on here that we're talking with, Joseph, just give us a quick little background on who you are and what you do, and kind of why you're involved in this conversation.
Sure. I'm a Latter-day Saint and a philosopher. I'm in grad school for philosophy, interested in philosophy of religion and some other areas. That's, I think, mainly why I'm here. I have a YouTube channel called LDS Philosophy where I, not recently, I plan to do some more videos soon, but I discuss issues in philosophy relevant to Latter-day Saints.
And you're studying at Yale currently, correct?
That's right. Yeah, doing my PhD there in philosophy.
Doing your PhD in philosophy at Yale. So someone to watch out for, everybody. Joseph, he is, the reason I invited Joseph on the show specifically was because I want him to make sure that I don't go off the rails philosophically because I'm not nearly as well trained as someone like him. And I brought on, this actually started originally because we wanted to bring on Emerson to talk with us today. Emerson, tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm currently a graduate student at PragerU, so I also have a fancy education like Mr. Yale over here. But no, so I grew up in like a Christian environment in the Midwest, in Michigan, like a Protestant Christian family. I don't know, maybe half of my family is in ministry. Like my grandpa's a Christian pastor, my uncle's a pastor. My parents have been in and out of like full and part-time ministry their whole lives. It looks like, maybe at least one or two of my siblings might be going into the family business, as it were. So, it's something it's been a part of my life, pretty intimately. And then around like 17 or so, the things were in motion. I started to deconvert. And then by 19, I was considering myself an atheist. But yeah, I didn't know much about Mormonism. I guess we'll get into my background with Mormonism as we go on. But yeah, I have a YouTube channel called Emerson Green where I talk about philosophy of religion mostly.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I got introduced to you. I think it was actually, originally I saw you on Twitter, and then eventually, and I noticed it was like, okay, here's an atheist who, or a non-believer who is being very fair and is trying to understand things that we're putting out there. And so I was kind of fascinated by that. And then I started listening to more of your content and stuff and found it to be really interesting. So everyone who's listening, be sure to check out Emerson Green on YouTube, has some great philosophy stuff. But then you started to interact with Latter-day Saints. And tell us a little bit about that. How did that kind of come about? And you end up having some really good conversations, one with Joseph on his channel and also with Tarek Lacour. But tell a little bit about how you got connected with Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, I can't retrace my steps exactly about when it first started, but I think it might have started with Tarek. I can't remember exactly how it started, but I do remember how we started talking, which was I made a joke that was widely misunderstood because it annoys me a lot when people say Mormons aren't Christians. So, when I feel like the best way to satirize someone's point of view is to agree with them totally and then just take it one step further than they actually want it to go. So like, I was like, well, obviously Mormons aren't Christians, but are they even theists? Do they believe in God? In fact, do they have beliefs? Like, do they affirm any propositions? And then there was just this flood of Mormons who were just like, of course I think they only read the first sentence or something. And then they were like, they were mad at me. I'm like, I'm trying to help you guys out here. Anyway, so then you said something and then Joseph fortunately stepped in and was like, Emerson is joking. Okay.
It was a good tweet. It was funny. It was very funny. I think you used some terms like doxastic states, and I think not everyone knows what that is. And so they just kind of glossed over that part and just read a Mormon's Christian. But it was good. It was a very funny tweet.
So then we started talking and then here we are. So
yeah, no. And it's funny because I noticed when I saw some of your stuff out there that there's a very typical stance that an atheist will have towards Christians, first of all. And then that disdain is even deeper when it comes to Latter-day Saints. It's like Christians are a joke and Mormons are a bad joke, right? Like that's kind of the levels to it. And you wrote a really interesting blog post I believe it was called, Is Mormonism the Least Plausible Form of Christianity? And in it, you kind of had summed up your sentiment that you had shared with Sam Harris. And I'll actually quote what it says here. You wrote in the article that, quote, Mormonism is objectively less credible than Christianity because Mormons are committed to believing nearly all the implausible things that Christians believe, plus many additional implausible things, end quote. And you went on to say, Christianity plus a lot of weird, implausible things. I think that's an accurate summation of how many view Mormonism. But I've come to believe that that view is entirely mistaken. That caught my attention. So tell us a little bit about maybe how that started to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so Harris is right that, theory B is less plausible than theory A. If theory B is just theory A plus a bunch of weird implausible things, like that's obviously true, but that's just not how I see Mormonism. I think that some LDS theology, like it's tantamount to just Christianity minus a bunch of weird implausible things. So some of those weird implausible things being like creation ex nihilo, or the view that, this world was created by a perfect being of unlimited power, or, eternal conscious torment for the vast majority of humanity. Like, you reject like the standard incoherent view of the Trinity. It's like, that's not Christianity plus weird things. That's Christianity minus weird things. Unless you think it's somehow advantageous to advocate this totally incoherent view of the Trinity, or it's a huge probability boost for Christianity when you say that most people are going to be eternally consciously tormented, or, creation ex nihilo posits some kind of, or has some kind of advantage. And like, I just don't see it that way. I don't know any atheists who would see it that way. So I think that, a lot of it just comes down to prejudice, because Mormonism is so recent and so near, like a lot of the stuff happened like, pretty close to where I'm sitting right now. And like, that's just kind of weird, like it's, I feel like David Hume made this point where he's like, a lot of these crazy stories, it always has to happen in some far off enchanted land, and whenever it's here, it just seems like sillier somehow, and there are like legitimate criticisms of Mormonism, like, but they seem to lean very heavily on like the historical and, scriptural side of things. And I'm more interested in philosophy. Like I don't care as much about that stuff. And I've heard Mormon apologists try to answer a lot of those like historical objections, and, sometimes it's plausible, sometimes it's not. But what's sure to me is that it's at least as plausible as the stuff that Christians say about the problems with the Bible. So I just don't see Mormonism as like, oh, it's just so much less plausible. It's just a bad joke compared to Christianity, which is just a joke. It's like, no, like their apologetics, your guys' apologetics is like just as convincing / unconvincing as the stuff that people will rattle off about, camels in the Old Testament or whatever it is. Like, so it seems like you guys are on equal footing when it comes to that stuff. But then on the more like philosophical side, you have definite advantages. So, And
you had mentioned in one of the interviews that the Christian critique of Mormonism comes across as sort of unprincipled, there's sort of a double standard that they apply to Mormonism that they don't apply to their own Christianity. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, I guess it does have mostly to do with those apologetics that I'm not terribly interested in, so I can't really speak in great detail. But it seems like some of the critiques of the of the LDS side of things, it does just seem unprincipled. Like they're applying a standard to you guys that they are not applying to themselves. So like one example is a sort of like hyper literalist interpretation of certain passages. So Mormons can avoid certain problems by just saying, well, I just don't take that literally. Regardless of who understood it literally in the past, like I just don't think it's supposed to be taken literally. And Christians sometimes will just not accept that, like when Mormons say it. And but if I, like as an atheist, like insisted that you had to take certain parts of Genesis literally, and then if you don't, you're just being dishonest or something, like, that would be very silly on my part. Like you don't have to take Genesis literally. Anyway, so that's just one example, like they don't really extend the same moves, the same courtesy to Mormons. Like a lot of the same apologetic moves that are available to Christians are available to anybody, and it's just Mormonism is so similar to Christianity, the kind of Christianity that they're defending. It's just at the end of the day, it's just not that different.
You can make a related point about I mean, like you, I'm much more interested in the philosophical side than I am in the historical, scriptural, exegetical side of kind of what you might call apologetics, or you know, the defense of a particular position in religion. And I think many people who, like, I guess, people that we interact with, the sort of people we interact with on Twitter, who are also interested in philosophy of religion, would say that Christian theism, Orthodox Christian theism, ought to be evaluated largely along philosophical lines, and we can set aside the historical issues for the most part because the philosophical issues are more compelling or important. But then Mormonism can be written off on historical grounds, right? And I think very few people are seriously looking at the philosophical and theological. I mean, insofar as things like eternal damnation. Few people are evaluating the Latter-day Saint position along those lines, and I think that's a mistake because I think, as you say, and I agree with you because I am a Latter-day Saint, that we have a very compelling case there on the philosophical side. I just think that's the more, well, for me, more interesting, but also in many ways more significant place to be looking than the kind of really probabilistic, messy stuff on the historical side.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I think so many Latter-day Saints get caught up in the apologetics around the historic, what I tend to call sort of, or one of our church leaders called kind of the secondary questions, right? Because if we get caught up in, like the seer stones or, something like that, it's like, well, wait a minute here. If God actually exists, and if the New Testament narrative is fundamentally true, then that paints an entirely different picture as to the way that you approach the Joseph Smith question, right? And so I like to spend most of my time looking at the fundamental questions, what I call kind of the level one conversation, which is very much where the philosophical questions exist in that space. And that when I explore Mormonism at that level, I find it's shockingly interesting. You know what I'm saying? Like, wait a minute, this is and the thing is these are the questions that are common not only to Christianity, but just to human beings. Like, is there purpose in life? Is there a God? What is the nature of reality? And Mormonism has things to say on those issues. And frankly, it has some fairly interesting things to say. And a lot of people just don't ever, like, especially a lot of Latter-day Saints who aren't philosophically inclined, they just never even get to look at those questions deeply, and they don't even recognize what they have. That what they have is something that's worth talking about and that is interesting. And on my channel, I spend a fair bit of time having those types of conversations. But one thing in particular, and I wanted to go into some of those in particular. Now, you have a critique of kind of theism that I thought is interesting, is sort of this idea of eternal conscious torment. And I wanted to hear kind of, if you could lay out kind of maybe why you think that's a problem, and then maybe we can explore Mormonism's take on that or how it deals with it.
Yeah, just as an aside, one of the things you said right at the beginning there made me remember another double standard here, which is just that some Christians will act like the fact that there is a new revelation at all is like inherently suspect. They're like, well, hang on, some of the things that are in, like the Book of Mormon contradict things that are in the Bible. It's like, there are some things in the New Testament that don't really square very well with things in the Old Testament. Like, are you as a Christian telling me you don't like the idea of like a new revelation at some point? Because
actually, and to that point, I do the same thing where I look at, I'm like, wait a minute here. If you're going to believe the New Testament narrative, like, oh, there were like miracles and things happening, like, oh, if it happens closer to now, that's evidence against it. Like, in my mind, it's like, if Jesus Christ really was who he claimed to be, and there was some sort of work of his going on, I would expect some level of the miraculous in the modern era. You know what I mean? So I don't look at our claims to miracles as necessarily a cut against it, unless a person sort of a priori just, they just start off from the presupposition that miracles can exist, don't exist, etc., which is a whole nother kind of philosophical discussion to have. But you're right. They apply double standards that they don't hold themselves to.
Yeah. Sorry for not answering the question.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I want to, I want you to answer what you need to. But I am curious though about that, because I think the idea of eternal conscious torment and kind of the traditional notions about hell are problematic. And one of the reasons that Latter-day Saint theology is attractive to me is because I think it resolves it. But what do you see as the problem with that idea of eternal conscious torment?
Well, it's just straightforwardly incompatible with theism. I mean, like, if you believe what's traditionally said about God, that he's like perfectly loving, that he's just and merciful and good, and then you say, oh yeah, and like the majority of people are going to be in some state of torment, like for all of time, you know, you start to try to work out how that might happen, and it just never coheres. You know, like like you have to start saying some incredibly silly things, and this has been pointed out very effectively by Christians. You know, like David Bentley Hart, who's, you know, written very convincingly about this, and I just think he's totally right that the people like me who have seen like the absurdity of eternal conscious torment and how it can't possibly be true with theism also being true. It's not that we're like geniuses, it's that it's just so obvious. It is just so it takes so much indoctrination and conditioning to think that something like eternal conscious torment could be compatible with love or justice or mercy. It takes like, you know, moral idiocy. It takes like just sort of a rejection of common sense. And like, if you pursue it further, it just makes less and less and less sense. It actually had, you know, a lot to do with why I deconverted to begin with, because I was sort of led to believe falsely that like this is an essential part of Christianity. Where like if you reject, you know, an eternal hell for non-believers, then you like, you know, you might as well just reject half of the other things Christians are supposed to believe as well, because that's just not a serious position. Like annihilationism was like this crazy liberal idea. Like universalism was a bad joke. Like where I grew up, it wasn't even really mentioned. I heard it mentioned like once in passing, like as like an obviously stupid and false thing. That was but like my only exposure to it. So yeah, and then it creates all these other problems. You know, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I have several videos.
Let me real quickly. I'll play the devil's advocate or the Christian's advocate here. That all right. So, well, wait a minute. All right, I'm a Christian, let's say, and I have the belief that there is an eternal hell for those who don't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And I make the claim that, well, you know, hell is just the absence of God, right? And therefore, if God exists, hell is just what happens when you don't have God. And so the eternal conscious torment is that, right? What would you say to sort of that kind of an argument?
So some of the arguments for universalism would kind of preclude that possibility, because if God is this, you know, perfectly good being, and he wants a relationship with you, any sort of rational being who wants what's best for oneself is going to eventually come to see that they should be in a relationship with this being of perfect love and goodness. And the only thing really that could stop that is if you don't really have like infinite chances, you know, to because I can see how like in a certain moment someone might reject that, but it would sort of be based on like a lack of understanding. Like, how could they possibly understand what they're rejecting and then still say, yeah, I don't want that? So it must be some kind of lack of understanding on their part. You know, it wouldn't be like how Christopher Hitchens sees it, like submitting to Big Brother or something. We're talking about like a being of perfect love and goodness. So, you know, any rational being would want to be in a relationship with that sort of being. And
it would be unjust to punish someone or to have someone eternally suffering because of their lack of understanding, right? Because of
it's a flaw in yourself that's going to keep you from doing that. Because if you could possibly understand what you were rejecting, then you just wouldn't reject it. If you would still reject it with full understanding of what it is, then you're insane. And I think it's wrong to let insane people torture themselves. So like, you know, it's just, it does seem kind of inevitable. But the conflicts with like mercy and justice and so on, it's like, there's nothing you could do where an eternal punishment would be just. You know, like the imbalance is literally infinite. There's no way that an eternal punishment could be compatible with mercy. It's the least merciful punishment that you could conceive of. You know, so it just seems like if mercy and justice and love and goodness mean literally anything like what we think they mean, then it's just obvious that an eternal punishment, that's not going to be just or merciful or good. And your guilt, you know, it's just never going to to make that kind of thing just, because you're a limited being. And there's just there's nothing you could do that would warrant like an infinite punishment. And there's also, you have to factor in that you're limited, that you don't fully understand what a rejection of God like means or entails. Anyway, I just think that if God really wants a relationship with you, then eventually, in the fullness of time, there could be one. And the only way that wouldn't happen is if God just arbitrarily cut things off at some point and said, that's it for you, But, Josh Rasmussen has made this sort of argument, like if we're given infinite chances, then eventually everyone will come to be saved because it's just what's in your rational best interest.
I see.
There's a fine line to be walked here. It's a really, it's a tricky. So obviously, one thing that you hear advocates of eternal conscious torment say is, can you imagine sharing eternal bliss with Hitler? Right? Like anyone who's committed really atrocious crimes in this life. Just makes sense. Say they deserve the exact same reward as someone else, right? All these things, right? So, and I think there's something you can feel a pull there. I mean, there's obviously some issues like are we saying that justice is just retributive or what, right? But I think there's a fine line, and so I've changed my mind a little bit on some of this in the Latter-day Saint position recently. I mean, I think there's a fairly broad range of positions Latter-day Saint can take. I think you can be a pretty strict universalist if you want to be, and I think like. Today, the consensus view seems okay. So the Latter-day Saint position, right, is that there are three kingdoms of heaven: the celestial, the terrestrial, and telestial, and they kind of correspond to different degrees of how good you were in this life, right? And then maybe there's also perdition, right? And it's not clear exactly what qualifies are going there, but we say that the 3 degrees are heaven and perdition is not. But it's not. But anyway, so basically, what I find attractive about this picture, at least what I would have said, is so like David Paulson, who just died recently, who's a Latter-day Saint philosopher, he criticized John Hick's universalism by saying, if everyone ends up in the exact same place, and that's kind of necessarily true, can we say that all of them are free in some full sense? So I think the way you put it, Emerson, which is a nice way to motivate that position, is if it's what's good for you and you're rational, you're going to choose that eventually, right? If you have infinite choices, that's going to be what you choose. And I'm not sure I agree with that fully. Like, I think it might be practically irrational, but you can be like fully cognitively developed and understand exactly what you're giving up and still choose. Maybe that's just like maybe because I accept libertarian free will, but I think it's probably possible for someone to still reject it. And then if you think that, then it looks kind of tricky to say that you've got this total universalism, right? And so what I find appealing about the Latter-day Saint picture is, on the one hand, it's basically universalist in the sense that my best guess as to what perdition is, this non-heaven king place, is someone who fully understands exactly what they're giving up and they choose to give it up anyway. And maybe again that's like practically rational. Certainly it's not what's best for them, but they have that. That's an option that's available. So no one's free will is abrogated, but it's still universalist in the sense that everyone has the exact same opportunity to get to a kingdom of heaven. Then that looks like it's still. So Joseph Smith, for instance, said something to the effect of, even the lowest kingdom, the celestial kingdom, if you understood how good it was, you'd kill yourself to get there. So it looks like everyone's getting rewarded, right? And so even the really wicked people, right, assuming that someone like Hitler doesn't go to perdition, he gets to give this really great thing. And so that, so on the one hand, it's universal. On the other hand, maybe you still run into problems with that kind of, even though it's tiered, you run into problems of like, is that something that someone like that deserves? And so one thing that I've come to think recently is it's maybe not quite as universalist as I had thought. It's still universal in the sense that no one is going to be suffering in fires of hell for eternity, except maybe the people who fully understand the decision to make it. But I've read recently, it's not the sort of thing I often read in philosophy, but it's Martin Hagler, at the beginning of Martin Haglin's book, This Life, where he makes an argument for atheism, actually, saying that what makes life worth living are certain types of finitude, like certain types of pain and caring about things, and you can't care about things if they can't fail, that sort of thing. That's kind of the rough idea of what he's saying. And then he says, well, if heaven is a place where there's just this perfection when you can't have any of these kinds of things that make life worth living, then heaven's not worth living. This is kind of a pragmatic argument against belief in God. And I actually think there's something right there. I think there's a certain kind of conception of perfection that would make life not worth living, right? Not having relationships with people, which I think is a pretty standard part of many Orthodox conceptions of heaven, I think would make that a life not worth living. But I think the Latter-day Saint conception has room for that, right? So like God has relationships with us because he's not simple and impassible, right? And he can have failures in the sense that people he's trying to bring to him can choose to, go to one of the lower kingdoms, let's say. And because Latter-day Saints have such a strong conception of theosis, we're in the same position in the next life as God, where we can have these relationships with beings that we're trying to bring up to be like us and fail. And so you can have these sort of relationships that make life worth living, right? But if that's right, it may be that kind of care in a really robust sense, like what Hagelin has in mind, is only possible in the highest kingdom. And so then maybe the lower kingdoms don't have lives that are quite as worth living, even though there's still going to be some kind of life worth living there, because it's still a kind of heaven. And so again, it's a very fine line. and this, I'm taking a fairly specific conception of what this afterlife looks like. I think Latter-day Saints, again, have quite a broad range. But if that's right, well, so on the one hand, you get everyone's in heaven, so you get the universalism. On the other, you get some kind of punishment insofar as you don't have quite the fullness of life. And we have, if we accept kind of Hagelin's formulation, we have a fairly specific conception of what that looks like, of why the lower kingdoms aren't just wonderful, or it's all not just really, really nice. There's something missing, but it's still a heaven. So you can you get punishment in the sense of not everyone who did really bad stuff in this life gets to enjoy the kind of fullest flourishing, but on the other hand, it's kind of universal. So anyway, so that's why I think that there's something really appealing about this, is you get to bring together a lot of these judgments or intuitions that we make, and to kind of fit it more or less into one picture, even though it's maybe a slightly more complicated picture than the standard one.
I was going to say real quick, kind of to back up the LDS versus other sort of conceptions of it. I think there's a reframing that a Latter-day Saint can do, and that I personally do when I look at the afterlife, that alters all of this. Because with the traditional sort of Christian conception of like, God is this judge, and you come to him and it's like, he sends you to eternal hell and torment forever, or he sends you to his wonderful kingdom of Disneyland that you get to live in forever and everyone's really happy and dances around, right? That binary view. First of all, that's troubling just because it's so binary, and human beings are not binary. But here's the thing. Latter-day Saints, and I may be wrong on this, so I'm not going to say that I represent all Latter-day Saints, but this is my read of what God is doing. God is not the ex nihilo creator of heaven and hell, who then dictates where you go per se. He's a loving father that exists within reality, and reality itself is what causes you happiness or sadness, joy or well-being or suffering. And what God is trying to do is he's trying to help you to reach the highest level of your potential that you can reach. And we all reach different levels of potential, to where we eventually, because we have free will, or agency as we call it, will, and those are slightly different conceptions, but he's trying to get you as far as you'll go. The torment isn't him tormenting you. That's the other thing, is that I have a belief that, and it's sort of a provisional belief that I'm still sorting out, but I hypothesize that God doesn't actually really punish anyone. It's us, that we choose consequences that harm us, and that God is trying his best to help us to avoid the consequences of choosing things that we should not choose. But we are not, I also would argue that we're not purely rational creatures. I believe human beings actually want things other than God, and we choose things other than God because somewhere deep in our souls, that's what we want. We just don't want him. And the great battle that goes on within the human soul is, what are we going to choose, right? And so the kingdoms of glory are a description of the different levels of glory and life to which we can obtain, with the highest life or way of being in the cosmos is to have a life like that of God, which is the highest level possible. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think that's actually that dovetails quite nicely with like an Aristotelian conception of kind of the relationship between flourish, like moral goodness and happiness, right? So like on Aristotle's view, right, kinds, like a humankind, has an essence, have essences, and the essences determine what their teloi are, these ends, and filling the end is what's good for you. It also makes you happy, right? So So it's this teleology. So you have a certain end that's based on your constitution as a kind,
a measure of your creation that you need to fulfill.
Exactly. And so I think this fits really well with that. So that was the standard view, and then Christians early on adopted something similar. They kind of incorporated that into their framework. But for Aristotle, these kinds are eternal, right? They're not created out of nothing. And so the tie between the happiness and the kind of flourishing goodness is really, really close. For Christians then, when they had this creation ex nihilo, you have to kind of depend on God putting the happiness and the flourishing kind of together, right? And moral goodness and happiness becoming together is almost like a contingent relationship, whereas for Aristotle it was necessary. And for Latter-day Saints, because we don't believe in a creation ex nihilo, I think you get this back. You get this really thoroughly, or you can have this really thoroughly Aristotelian conception where we have a certain constitution, just that's the way it is. God didn't make us this way, more or less, right? Kind of a fundamental nature. And so we have this telos, we have this certain end that determines what our flourishing looks like. And so, I think that's absolutely, I think that the way you described it is the way I think of it is reality in some sense, right? I mean, this is just the way we are. God didn't make us have these certain ends be what's good for us, but he's trying to help. He says, get there. I'll do what I can to help you get there. And that's kind of the loving, bring you to heaven element. And if you don't get there, then you're just going to suffer as a result of the fact that happiness is tied to flourishing, and flourishing is tied to your constitution as a kind. Right? So I mean, I think the picture you paint fits really nicely with that kind of Aristotelian conception.
And that picture of growth and personal evolution and development, it almost makes more sense if that's what God did himself, and like he's helping us do the thing that he went through, like a more literal sense of a father. Anyway, preview of things to come, of discussion too that's coming. But just fun. On the afterlife, something I said before I really knew anything about Mormonism. So this is on the record, I couldn't pretend that I didn't say it. I was like, look, it would make a lot more sense if the afterlife wasn't so binary. Like, it's just so crazy. There's this place of like eternal torment, like this maximal suffering, oh, the doors are locked from the inside. Yeah, whatever. However you want to justify it. The point is there are only these two places to go. And it's like, why are there no gradients? Because like you say, people are not binary. Like it doesn't make any sense that there are just these two sorting bins, basically. At the end of the day, for most Christians, it's still just these two places, And then I was like, look, if God were real, why wouldn't he make these different like sort of levels of the afterlife? Like if we were not great, why couldn't we just continue to live in something that's kind of like Earth, And then, I learned more about the Mormon view, and it's like there are literally these like gradients to the afterlife where, it's basically exactly what I was saying, where I was just like, well, if the Christian God was really real, maybe this is how things would be. And then it's like, oh, that's exactly the, the Mormon view.
Think to some extent it plays into the problem of evil, right? Which is another thing that for classical theists, I'm of the opinion that the problem of evil is fatal to classical theists. I have never found a way around that problem myself. If God is the creator of everything ex nihilo, well, by logical necessity, part of everything is evil, and therefore God becomes the author of evil. Even if people choose to do things, but God, because of their nature, people choose to do bad things. Well, where did that nature come from? If not,
the Christians are just like, okay, it's like the demons who are responsible. It's just like, oh, so God didn't create evil. He just created the people who created evil and then doesn't stop them after that happened. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes way more sense. But yeah, it's like if God is this ex nihilo creator and he has unlimited power, and he's like perfectly good, then he could have done anything, and like you just like look out the window and it's like, this is the best he could do. Like,
and the fall of Adam and Eve story, in my opinion, makes no sense. Okay, so you created people to be in this perfect paradise. You're this perfect, all-knowing, all-loving creator, and yet you created this paradise for them to live in, and then you created their nature such that they would choose to eat of the forbidden fruit instead of just staying in the garden, and you didn't stop them from eating the fruit, even though you could have, and then the whole world falls. Oh, and now you have to sacrifice yourself to yourself in order to atone for the mistakes that they made because of the nature that you gave them. Like it ends up seeming so absurd. It's like something's wrong in this equation. If we're to take this story in any way seriously, even seriously from like a mythological standpoint, from being just an irrational tale of la, like there's got to be more to it. And so the Christians have a very, I think, challenging time because of, and it all, in my opinion, as I've studied out, comes back to this creation ex nihilo. If everything is created, if God is not within an eternal reality, but he actually was the organizer of the reality and he could have organized it in any way, why did he organize it the way that he did?
Yeah, and any remotely plausible version of that kind of like maximalist theism is going to have to say like this is not the best God could do. Like for some reason God is doing less than his best. And like those speculations, you know, there's better and worse you know, forms of it, but it's just like at the end of the day when you're looking at, you know, millions of years of predation and you know, you go through like a pediatric oncology ward, it's like come on, like I mean, how there must be some kind of relevant difference between us and God, where you know God is watching all this unfold and he's not doing anything. Like he could, you know, he's just, you know, so it would obviously be immoral for us to see this kind of stuff and not do anything about it. But for some reason, it's fine for God to do it, even though he could totally prevent it. And I have a very hard time accepting any of the stories that are typically offered for why it's different for God or for why God, you know, can't do anything. And you know, the kind of LDS more limited God, you know, at least prima facie it does get around some of those problems. But I'm curious what you guys think about that may be coming back to bite you in other ways. Like if God is limited such that he can't prevent, you know, pediatric oncology wards, but he's not limited such that like he's issuing revelations, you know, and inspiring texts and performing miracles. You know, I assume you guys believe that there were miracles performed to like validate the new revelation. So I don't know. So these limitations seem very like hit and miss, you know,
and can they be problematic? I actually want to address that, and I want to go into specifically the problem of evil from a Latter-day Saint conception with some of those problems. But before we do, there is a form of Christianity that I have found that actually does deal with this in a logically coherent way. It just ends up being absolutely terrifying, and that's the Calvinist view.
I was going to mention that. Yeah, you can make this really all consistent if you just say, this is what God. This is fine. He thinks this is the right thing to do. Right? He
gave the kids
all determined, and yeah, right. That's totally consistent. And I think many people, perhaps most people who aren't Calvinists, think that's totally abhorrent. Right?
That's what I like to do with classical theists is try and challenge them from the Calvinist perspective and say, look, if your God is totally sovereign and all powerful, then the logical conclusion must be that and the Calvinists will just say it. It's like, yep, he predestined this person to suffer and to die and to be terrible and to go to hell forever. And it's like, and it's totally logically consistent. And your God is an absolute monster that I want to have nothing to do with. Right. And they're just kind of like, well, that's kind of just the way it is. And he predestined you to think that way. But the Latter-day Saint conception does resolve a lot of this by creating a God that exists within some sort of a framework that in some sense he's subject to. He's subject to, as we would consider, eternal law, that there is some level of reality to which even God himself operates within constraints. And while that can limit God in some way or get away from this perfect being theology, which would then say, well, then that law is God. That is the ultimate kind of thing, which is another subject that I could get into. I actually think that when we talk about God or when other people talk about God as being impassible, immutable, immaterial, all that kind of stuff, I actually look at that as what they're describing is the eternal law that even God himself is subject to. But God himself as a being is the one who exists within that space at the highest level of being and who is trying to raise us up to that level. Now, why, like, the problem of evil. Let me do this. I have a conception of how to deal with the problem of evil from a Latter-day Saint conception. Like you're saying, go to a pediatric oncology ward, see the horrible sufferings of like my wife she's watching the series, The Crown. You guys ever heard about that horrible coal mine accident where there was a bunch of coal that was in this giant pile and it rained on it in England in like the 1960s? It avalanched down the hill into an elementary school and buried 116 children alive.
Wow.
I mean, just one of these things is just the worst possible things, right? And yes, those things are gut-wrenchingly difficult. And then you have to you do ask, if God could give a revelation to help me find my keys, why couldn't he
Why couldn't he give a revelation to the guy who put, the giant boulder on top of the hill with the elementary school at the bottom of the hill? And then it's like, oh no, this unforeseeable disaster has occurred.
Yes, no, and these are real kind of challenging questions. And so I want to punt to you real quick, Joseph. I'd like to hear your take on it, and then I'll kind of build off of that any things that I have to add, because I have a particular view as well.
Yeah, I think it's easy for Latter-day Saints, and I see this fairly often, to kind of say, well, we've solved the problem of evil because, and then they list a couple of features that we have that are of our theology, our conception of God, that's different than the Orthodox view. And I think we ought not to be so blasé about it. Right? This is not a cut and dry case, super clear. That's it, it's solved, no problems, right? This is a very difficult problem. We ought to take it extremely seriously. And I think Emerson has pinpointed one of the places very clear why there's still a problem for us. We think that God can do things like, allow someone to translate a language that they don't know and speak to us, and he can part the Red Sea. I think the vast majority of Latter-day Saints think all those sorts of miracles are totally literal. But yeah, he can't prevent a specific child from getting cancer. He can't prevent this coal from falling down the hill. Surely in the sense of like, it's within his metaphysical power to do that. Surely he could, right? So we all take it very seriously. So that, what are the resources Latter-day Saints have that many other Christians don't have to help deal with this? I think not having creation ex nihilo is a big part of it. As you say, Jacob, natures aren't made by God, right? So you don't have to even get into the whole like planting as solution where we're like God can only some of us are just evil across all possible worlds or something. Or we have certain dispositions across all possible worlds. We don't have to get into that because God didn't create our nature. So that if our natures are inclined to sometimes do evil, that's not on God, right? Additionally, we also have the fact that we believe in a pre-existence, right? Everyone who's on Earth right now chose to participate in this, presumably with more or less full knowledge of what was going to happen. So we consented to it. That's, I think, another big plus. I think the fact that, as Emerson said, is we could limit God. God is not this super maximal, absolute sovereign being in the Latter-day Saint conception. And so that's one of the premises of the kind of logical problem of evil, right? God's omnipotent, God's all good, evil exists. That's supposed to be an inconsistent triad. Well, God's omnipotent, we think, but not in the same way as everyone else thinks. We don't think God can even create ex nihilo. That's a big limit. God can do everything that's possible to do, but there's lots of things that isn't possible to do. So I think those are maybe the three biggest things that are real advantage for Latter-day Saints to address the problem of evil. As far as then what does it look like when we solve it? I don't know, personally. So I actually, embarrassingly, I still haven't read Blake Ostler's book on the problem of evil. I'm told it's a very compelling case against the classical Christian being able to answer the problem of evil, and in favor of Latter-day Saint being able to solve it.
That's something I like a lot about listening to Mormons, is you find them saying things that you can only hear atheists saying in other contexts. So like when I watched the interview with Blake Ostler that was on this channel, he was making a pretty good case against, classical theism, and also, this pretty compelling description of the problem of evil. And it's like it sounds a lot like two atheists talking about the problem of evil at many points.
It's funny that I actually get that from other Christians sometimes. Is basically that we're atheist light, that because we don't have this omni God that is that way, that we essentially are atheists in some way. And I do find that there are, but in my mind, it's sort of like some of these atheist critiques are legitimate critiques, and so Mormonism comes at it with a view that oftentimes takes that into account, right? And then provides explanations that I find really compelling, where theism can still be maintained while still addressing some of these critiques from atheists. Now, with the problem of evil in particular, so here's kind of my take on it. I think one of the things that gets wrong is that it gets framed, the problem of evil is more a problem of suffering. And I like to talk about it because the suffering obviously is part of it. But the problem of evil, as I see it, is really the problem of injustice. Because we can understand suffering to be okay if, as we suffer, it ultimately is for some greater good down the road. It's the fact of suffering caused by someone for no good reason. There's a level of injustice to it that makes it perverse.
It's gratuitous, I think, is the kind of the standard
Yeah.
term for the exact what you're pinpointing there is
And
gratuitous evil.
And so there's a question of, the question isn't necessarily why there is suffering per se. It's why is there suffering that's not justified? That is, like you're saying, gratuitous. That's just, it's suffering for suffering's sake. It doesn't seem to have any purpose or reason to it. It's just, it's perverse. It offends our moral sensibilities. And therefore we say, okay, if there was a God and this God is just, this doesn't align with a just God, because a just God doesn't allow for this to happen. So here is my sort of way that I zoom out on it and take it into account. I used to teach when I was a missionary that to think of God as, think of the pre-existence like we lived at home as children with our parents. And we all know that you could live with your parents forever. Like, I mean, us mortally, like I have children, I have 4 kids, and I could keep them in my house and I could continue to provide for them and all of that. But all of us know that that's a problem. That's not good. That's bad for their development, right? So I have to send them out of my house. I have to send them into a world where I am not, or at least where my interaction with them is limited in some way. Okay. Now, that world is, I'll call that the world of injustice. It's a world where you could walk out of your house tomorrow and you could get struck by lightning and die, or your kid could get cancer, and it's the thing about it that makes it unjust is that it's random. It's like you don't know what's going to happen. So imagine, I like to, and maybe this is a bad analogy. I'm just doing my best to go through this, but you walk to the door with your Heavenly Father and you look out at the world and you know that it's the world of injustice. You know that this is the world where any of these things can happen. You don't know exactly what's going to happen. Even God doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. But you know that the only way that you can become the way He is to go out there into that world, into, as we would maybe say in LDS speak, the lone and dreary world, to some degree separated from God, to have an experience in which you are faced with actual injustice, actual chaos, actual, like your kid can get cancer, or you could, and the other aspect of this injustice is you could have everything go right for you in your life. You could win the lottery and have a beautiful wife. And it's like, but that also is unjust. Like you didn't deserve that, yet you had all these good things happen. And so it creates this world, this perverse world, but it's the only way to get to be like God and to develop yourself in this sort of theosis journey is to pass through that experience. And the way that you sort of use your agency within that context really determines what you are. And so within the problem of evil, all of the suffering in the world, including the gratuitous suffering. In fact, the gratuitous suffering is kind of like, that's part of it. It's the injustice of the world is what is actually a part of the bigger macro plan that has to happen. And so again, not sure if that is a perfect resolution, but it's a way that I, in my mind, kind of deal with it by framing it as the need for injustice in the great cosmic story.
If I could just I have 2 small things to add to that. I mean, one is that if it does play some role in moral development, then it's not really gratuitous. Like if it's the only way to get this kind of moral development, then it is like by definition not gratuitous suffering. Mm-hmm. Gratuitous suffering would be something that doesn't contribute to anything, and just is soul destroying. It doesn't help you become more like God. Like if anything, it makes you less like God. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think there is that kind of suffering in the world. Now, like whether or not that can be explained, I think that the King Follett stuff is not like just some impractical, like, kind of fun question. Like, I think the plausibility of what you just said would actually be added to if you take a certain view of how God himself came to be. Because, I mean, other atheists have asked, like, what is the value of this soul building and this evolution? Especially if you view God as the basis of all value, as like many Christians do. It's like God never went through this. God never was, he never evolved. Like he never went through a process of soul building. So why can't he just like create us in sort of, you know, whatever the final form is supposed to be? Why wouldn't he just do that? And I feel like one advantage that Mormons can have is they say, well, he can't, you know, like that's impossible for some reason. He's not like omnipotent in the maximalist sort of way. And secondly, it's not just the value of being like God, it's the value of becoming like God. Like if God is, you know, like the basis of value in some sense, then the fact that he, you know, became God is something that is inherently valuable, I would assume. At least it makes more sense. Like, oh, look, you're going through this process. That's the same thing that God did. You know, like, it's not like you have to go through something that is totally and utterly different from what God went through in order to become more like him. But yeah, if you're treating God as the basis of value, and then you think, well, look, I'm going through the same process that, you know, my like heavenly Father went through, then there's more plausibility to that story to me, of like, rather than just saying like, oh, and for God and for you, the rules are totally different for some reason.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, Jacob, something like what you said has to be along the right lines, right? We have to say there's something about like the systematic nature of suffering that is essential to our moral development or something. Although I think that Emerson's right that probably means that there can't be actual gratuitous suffering in the sense that it doesn't contribute to anything, right? But yeah, but I think.
But can I make a quick comment on that with the gratuitous suffering? Because I agree from your perspective, Emerson, that when you look out into the world without an eternal perspective where injustice is actually part of some bigger plan, that it's just pure injustice. There's no redemption to it. It is gratuitous suffering. I think that unless you have, but I think that you can construct within a Latter-day Saint framework a picture of there is an eternal reality in which it is necessary to pass through a world of true injustice in order to be made to be like a Father in heaven, and to become like God is. But again, it's a matter of that perspective. And here's the thing, like I take it to a really dark place, and people have noticed this, is like I think the world is so full of gratuitous suffering that my conclusion of is existence worth it on the macro scale when you take it all into account is no. I believe that we live in a fallen world in absolute need of redemption. Otherwise, this whole project isn't worth it. It would be better that it never happened at all, right? And I use this analogy. I say, you know, just because some people on the train to Auschwitz had a great time doesn't mean you shouldn't stop the train to Auschwitz, you know? And so my belief is, and Christians, I think, should share this view that we live in a fallen world, and the nature of that fallen world without redemption is as dark as it goes. My contention is that the Christian message is that no, there's hope, there's redemption. This is actually part of a great soul-making journey to become like God is, and I find that to be very compelling. So anyway, I'm sorry, Joseph. I'll give it back to you.
No, that's right. I think I don't have to be genuine injustices, but I think if they're gratuitous in the technical sense of like not justified, then by definition they're not justified. And I think Emerson's right to say that if any of those evils exist,
yes,
right, then any kind of, I think it also Latter-day Saint theism is falsified. But you know, there's the epistemic problem of when we try to identify a particular evil as gratuitous or not. I think as you put it, as having the eternal perspective, I think. Yeah, our claim has to be that no particular instance of suffering, when you have the right perspective, is gratuitous. But I think one of the I think Emerson's you're right in identifying a way in which, I guess maybe we're going to talk about this. This conception of God having been exactly like us and developing to be like God is a real advantage for Latter-day Saints, because you don't have to say that there's some fundamental difference in what's good for us and what's good for God. And I think it's related to the problem of heaven, right? So people will say, why couldn't you know, one of the ways to respond to the problem of evil is to say this is the best possible world. God couldn't have done any better than this. And then people respond by saying, why couldn't he have just made heaven? Heaven is a state in which it's really, really good and no one can sin. So if you have this really maximal conception of God and that's the end goal, then surely he could just make that right now. What's the problem with that, right? That's one of the ways to kind of push back on certain kinds of responses to the problem of evil. And I think for Latter-day Saints, yeah, it's related to this idea that like God is really, really good, but also isn't maybe free in the same way that we are. If you think he couldn't sin, there's a different kind of freedom that we have. And so, those are very closely related problems. Of Latter-day Saints, on the one hand, heaven doesn't look quite the same. If we're right that there can be failures of certain kinds in heaven, maybe not sin. But I think Emerson's right on the point when he says, if you think that God also developed in a certain way, had to develop in a certain way, right? So like maybe what it is to be generous, you wouldn't meet the criteria for having genuine generosity if that were just like implanted in you ex nihilo, right? You have to have gone through a process of developing it, or it doesn't count as a genuine virtue or something, right? And I think that has to be part of the answer to the problem of evil. That doesn't by itself. I think, like I said, Jacob, something like what you outlined has to be right, but it doesn't explain why, Paul Draper, a particular deer died in a forest fire that no one had any idea about.
And my thing with that is that I don't feel like I have to provide the answers to those things. When I say that the world is a world of injustice and a world of chaos, I say, well, why did those kids that we were just talking about in that horrible coal mine accident, why did that have to happen? It didn't have to happen. It just did happen. The world has a level of randomness to it. Now, on a macro scale, you could say that it's sort of like, imagine that I created some environment, but then the environment sort of does what it's going to do, right? And it has its own free will and agency, and the people within it can do the things that they're going to do. And but I had to make this realm that people are going to walk through, but I don't fully control every aspect of everything that's going on in it. That to me is like, that's the world we live in. So for me, intellectually, when something bad happens, I'm just like, it's a true tragedy in the sense that it did not have to happen, but it did. But on the macro scale, like, we all agreed to come to a world where that could happen, and it could happen to me.
Right.
Well, it seems like there are a couple different things going on. Like, one is the consent basis where, that does change things. If you consent to things, and, even if bad things do happen, then it's different than if you were just kind of thrown in like without your consent. But then there's this other concern about, viewing the world as this kind of moral arena, like aimed at soul building, which to me, it just self-evidently is not. Like, that's just not how the world is set up. It's like, if the world was some kind of, moral arena of soul building and development, then that would be pretty good evidence for theism, actually. Like, if there's all this suffering and it's like, it makes you more like God ultimately. Like, even though there are all these, instances of terrible suffering, it doesn't seem like it's a real tragedy in the sense that it didn't contribute to anything that was sort of worth it, all things considered. But yeah, I just don't think that the morally random world that you're talking about, it's not that it's like inconsistent with theism, but it is definitely evidence for atheism. Like, if the world is as morally random as you're making it sound, well, that's evidence that God doesn't exist, because that you would expect that on an indifferent universe. If the universe is totally indifferent, then you would expect a morally random universe. But you have less reason to expect it on theism, even the kind of theism that you're outlining.
I agree. And I think that we just have to confront the fact that that is the way the world is. The world is random, and things just happen for all sorts of gratuitous reasons. And I think that that is probably the best evidence for atheism. However, I don't see it as conclusive. And in fact, any theism that doesn't account for that fact honestly can't stand. That's one of the reasons that, for me, the problem of evil is so fatal to other theists. Latter-day Saints can say that, hey, this morally sort of random universe where things happen out of nowhere, I think that within our conception of a God that exists within an eternal reality and is trying to help us to make it as high as possible, that I think it's much easier to square that sort of a world with that sort of a theology than a theology that says God literally controls everything, and God caused Anne Frank to die in the concentration camp, and it was part of his purpose for her. I have a harder time with that sort of theism than a truly unjust world theism that I kind of look at, that we must pass, but it's a pass-through phase rather than the final state.
Well, here's a very implausible version of theism. You begin to exist totally at the moment of your birth here on this planet. You live for like 60 to 80 years, and if you acquire the wrong beliefs, You go to a place of eternal conscious torment
You're
forever.
You're sent to that place of eternal conscious torment.
Yeah, the doors are locked from the inside, and for some reason you never leave. And you know, it's like there. And then meanwhile, while you're on Earth, you see all these terrible things. And there's this especially annoying group of morons called skeptical theists who keep telling you that it's not gratuitous, even though it obviously is. And then you die and go to hell. And then that's where you live forever. And then all that, apparently non-gratuitous suffering, just didn't lead to any. Here's where it all ended up, like it's just you and Anne Frank and everyone else went down the chute, and you're just sitting there with the unlocked door and you never leave, because you just can't stand the idea of being in a relationship with a being of perfect love, because that would just be so appalling to you. Of course that's less plausible than the thing that you're outlining, but I mean, it's hard to think of something that's actually less plausible than, especially when you start adding like, oh, and by the way, this is all very good and consistent with justice and mercy and love and so on. Obviously that's not true, but there are a lot of people for whom that just is Christianity, and I mean that's why there are as many atheists as there are, in part because these very implausible versions of Christianity are just viewed as Christianity.
Yeah, I'm against false religion. I always say this to my atheist brother. I'm as hard at trying to convince people away from bad religion as I am trying to help people move towards belief away from atheism. Not that we're here trying to just like convert you here. Oh, that'd be wonderful.
This is all a trap, actually.
It's all a trap. It is. But one other thing that you said, and not to change gears too much, but as we get into kind of the latter half of this, you said something in an interview that I thought was really interesting and unique coming from someone who's a non-believing atheist. You said something along the lines of that Joseph Smith, in your estimation, wasn't just some con man out there based on what you know about him. Do you want to speak a little bit to that? Because I found that to be a really interesting comment for someone like you to make. I totally agree with it, but I wanted to hear if you've come to some of the same conclusions that I have.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that the best explanation of Joseph Smith's behavior is that he was a fraud and a con man. I think he was a true believer. I mean, that doesn't mean that, he was right, but, and I actually don't think it's that unusual among the more thoughtful atheists. I think like the first person who I heard this from years ago was Michael Shermer, like where he just said like, oh yeah, Joseph Smith was a true believer. And I think this was on like Joe Rogan's podcast or something. And, Rogan was kind of like, joking about how like obviously self-interested and fraudulent like Joseph Smith was. And Shermer was like, no, I think he was like a true believer. Like, I think he really, at least he believed what he was saying, in most cases. But, there's something I was, when I was like a teenager, I remember watching the show House, and there was a Mormon who was on the show, a Mormon character. And then House at one point says, just admit that Joseph Smith was a horny fraud. And then the guy like punches House. But it's like, that's kind of the standard theory among many Christians, actually, and many atheists, which is that, the horny fraud theory. So there's no denying the former, but the latter, I think, is probably not the best explanation of his behavior. It's not like some kind of like weird theory on my part. I just don't think I think when you look at his behavior and the cost that he paid, and when you look at like the whole of his life, it's hard to believe that someone was just lying to that degree day in and day out. Like that's not good for. I mean, look, if he was a con man, then he is he's
the greatest con man. I have a hard time finding anyone else. I mean, the level of, to start a religion with this many people and to know that you're just like shysting people the whole time.
Yeah. You are self-consciously a fraud, like for every sermon, everything you ever write. Like,
well, every person that's around him. Yeah. And that also are like backing him up. They're all in on the conspiracy. Like
or idiots, right? Or they're just absolute morons. Right?
All of them had to be delusional beyond belief to some extent. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the argument some people want to make. But when I see the character of some of the people that he was around and the things they did, like I'll use Brigham Young for example. People can believe whatever you want about Brigham Young, But here's the thing, from a purely historical standpoint, you have a guy who started as like a furniture maker in New England. And the guy like literally goes out west and like settles the West with these people, and just an incredible story of history and politics and religion and all of it mixed up. Like that's a unique individual, regardless of how you put it. And there's a bunch of other ones that were that these people would have had to have been totally crazy. And maybe some people think that they were, but they were sincere. And the fraud, they were knowingly defrauding people is just not. I agree with you 100%, obviously.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. Yeah, no, it's like, that's my only point, is like, you can still believe that they're morons if you want, but they were sincere, like they were sincere morons. But, like you think about I don't think they were morons, but you think about like the group that became the Seventh-day Adventists, and like how they went up on this hill, they gave away all their possessions, they went on the top of the hill and waited to be, raptured or whatever. Didn't work out, then they did it again later. It would almost be like looking at the people who did that and saying, oh yeah, frauds and con men. It's like, no, that's just a bad explanation. Like, you don't understand people very well if you're somehow going to fraud for that, and it's not just because there wasn't an obvious like material gain or something. Like, you don't understand religion very well. Like, you don't understand human psychology very well if you're looking at, the formation of a religion and thinking, oh, I know what it is, it's fraud. It's like, that's not how religions typically form. I mean, especially if you're a naturalist. I think this is why Christians are more prone to this, the horny fraud model than atheists are, actually, in my experience. Because we think every religion formed naturalistically. So like, why would this one be any different? Like, why do we have to invoke a totally new sort of explanation just because Joseph Smith got around a little bit? Like, it's just like, okay, look, that doesn't mean it's like a totally different model. Like, if you're a Christian, though, you think that, I guess you think every religion formed naturalistically except for yours. And I think that, that's why they're pushed into some of these, to my mind, less plausible explanations, because the formation of Mormonism was a lot like the formation of Christianity, so it's like, it's kind of, there has to be some crazy obvious difference, for them. Whereas for naturalists, we're like, formed the same way Christianity formed, it's like, fraud is just not a good explanation in most cases when it comes to religious groups like that.
Yeah. And I share that belief when it comes to other religions. I don't generally hold to the fraud argument for any significant religion. I believe they come from places of sincerity. And so I do think that I admire that you go to that point, because I also have noticed that other people that are really intellectually honest and that do a serious look at the origins of our church, they come to the same conclusion, that like the fraud theory isn't a good theory. You can say that they're mistaken, they're delusional, whatever, but the fraud theory doesn't hold. And so I think if people want to be more serious in their critique of the church, they'll stay away from that one, because most Latter-day Saints as well, we look at the history, we know the history, and we go, look, the fraud argument is a hard one to push on us, because we know the history, and it's very hard to fit fraud into that model.
And I will say something that is interesting to me about the restored gospel, as it were, is that there are genuine like similarities between the earlier forms of Christianity and Judaism, even, and I don't like coincidences. So it's like, to me, it seems like there are, two, basic explanations of those alignments. One is that, the Mormon explanation that I assume you guys favor. And then one is that, Joseph Smith must have known about these things somehow. Like, maybe, I mean, we know something about like his library and like the books that he had access to. So it's like, if you could find something there, or like a friend maybe who like knew about this stuff, like, that's where I would look. But, it would just be bizarre to just chalk a lot of these things up to coincidence. Like, there are certain pieces of evidence that do favor Mormonism. Like, I'm not going to pretend that it's not weird that there are like certain similarities with LDS theology and with what we can tell about the early church, or again, even some of the things that predated that. It does sound like a restored gospel in some ways. So either, that's a crazy coincidence, or Joseph Smith kind of knew what he was doing. He'd like read something and like he was maybe more educated than we realize, or maybe, there's the more genuine explanation that you guys favor.
I've had a very, and I'll give you the floor here in just a second, Joseph. That has been, as I've looked for on an evidential level at my beliefs, that's been one of the strongest, is the mystery of Joseph Smith. There's a lot there that's like, whoa, he must have known those kinds of things, or there's things that just seem implausible as they come out. But Joseph, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think part of the problem here is just the way that almost everyone who isn't fairly well read, well, I mean, you don't have to be particularly well read, but there's an attitude in lots of discourse around religion that if something's false, I mean, in lots of things generally, but it comes out in religion often. If something's false, they can't have any evidence in favor of it, right? You see new atheists say this. We also see Christian apologists say things like this, right? It can't be that if Christianity is true, it can't be that the problem of evil is evidence for atheism. Atheism is false, so there can't be any evidence. There can't be anything that rationally makes you think it's right. So, and that's obviously that's just mistaken, right? If you're, I think, even quite novice in whatever philosophy of religion, Bayesianism, philosophy generally. But even any field, history, right? Like you just know that's not true. And so, yeah, I think lots of people will want to say, no, the best theory for why Joseph Smith had, let's say the Book of Mormon has parallels with ancient types of literary forms or something. The best explanation has to be that he knew, right? He read something. We have to postulate that this book was in his area or something like that, right? And they kind of submit, like, that's how I make my view consistent, because I think that Joseph Smith was not a prophet. And that's evidence against my view, but that's fine because the total evidence favors me, right? No, people are very rarely willing to admit that. I don't know if it makes you look weak or if they don't realize that that's fine, right? But I think I'm happy to admit that the problem of evil is evidence for atheism, because I think there's stronger evidence against atheism. And I think in the same way, people should want to say, yeah, like just as Emerson is doing, yeah, that's weird. Like, I have to say either he knew more or it's a coincidence, but that's evidence against my view that I have to say that, because it doesn't fit, the actual documentary evidence or whatever that we have doesn't favor that view, and that's fine because I have better evidence otherwise. Right? I just think people should be more willing to say that, and they'll look a little bit less ridiculous.
Yeah,
and that's why I like good philosophers, because good philosophers are willing to do that, unlike ideologues like me. Well, cool.
Can I ask you guys? I don't know where you're about
Yeah.
to take it, but I don't want to leave without talking about the King Follett stuff.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's
Even
kind of
though-
end this. That'll be kind of the last, let's say, 15 minutes or so here. Let's talk
Okay.
about that.
Cool. Yeah. No, I was, we can resist going back to Joseph trying to talk me out of the advantage I was trying to give you guys about universalism. But yeah, no, the King Follett, what is it called? Discourse?
Or
Discourse.
sermon. It's been referred to as both discourse and
Okay.
sermon. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I love explaining this to people who don't know about it. Like, this, at least it's one view, that seems somewhat common within LDS circles. And you can tell me, where I'm misunderstanding it, if I am. But it sounds like there's this infinite regress of beings becoming God, this very like literal understanding of theosis, where, ordinary beings kind of develop into gods and then create, out of pre-existing material, not ex nihilo, other beings that become like God, who then create other beings that become like God. And it goes like that in both directions infinitely. It's a very like trippy view. I remember first telling someone about it and he was like really excited. He's like a total atheist and he was just like, that is wild. He's like, that's awesome. And like, I don't, the first thing is that I think it's possible to complete an infinite series. So I don't think there's any problem with the infinite regress. I already sort of favor an eternal universe anyway. And now lately, as I've been thinking about this problem of psychophysical harmony, there's one way of solving the problem, which is called panagentialism, which sounds a lot like the story that I just outlined of very simple beings becoming more complex and more godlike until they create other things. Like you could easily turn that into evidence for Mormonism. Plus, the panagentialist story involves something that's called like rational matter. So actually, in addition to the King Follett stuff, I was hoping to get more of an explanation of the connection between intelligence and physical material, because I know that's a part of the Mormon view of nature. But yeah, what do you guys think about the King Follett stuff and like intelligent matter and so on?
You want to go first, Joseph?
Sure. So I don't know what to think. I mean, okay, so there's so much to say. So the King Follett discourse is one of the best documented, maybe the best documented of Joseph Smith's sermons, right? So we have several accounts, and you can what you read online, if you read it, a kind of straightforward, written like someone would have read it or would have spoken it. That's an amalgamation of different sets of notes that we have, some more or less complete sets of notes, and they do conflict, so we don't know exactly what was said. So there's some trickiness there. There's a couple of places in particular where it's like really important points or there's disagreement in the notes, so it's really difficult. And then the other thing that Latter-day Saints will often preface discussions of the King Follett discourse with is it's not canon, and so it's not clear how far we're committed to what it says, right? I don't know. This is messy stuff, but
is it true though that most Mormons do believe?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think the overwhelming majority of lay Mormons in the US, I have absolutely no sense of what people. I imagine many Latter-day Saints outside the US don't even think about this.
I would put it majority, but I wouldn't necessarily say like huge vast.
Oh,
majority.
really? Okay.
I think it is the kind of the standard, especially if you go back in time. I think that number grows. I think if you go back to like the 1970s. Or 1930s, like, yeah, it'd be like pretty much everybody. Mm-hmm. But I think that there has been, and I think rightly so.
Except the infinite regress model is what we're saying here, right?
Yeah, the infinite regress model of God and a father and a father and a father all the way back. So there's kind of these two models. There's the infinite regress model, and then there's the monarchical monotheism model. That's the Blake Ostler model. That's the idea that there is a chain in one direction, but in the other direction, it's just
God is a stopping point. Yeah. Yes. And the difficulty here is that basically there's kind of a weirdness in the text that we have. Basically, Joseph Smith cites a scripture and then he says something, and they look like they're kind of at odds. And basically, if you think that the scripture is the more important part of what he was saying, then you take let me think. Then I think you accept Blake Ostler's view, and accept what he literally said. It looks like he's saying an infinite regress model. So there's a kind of fine interpretive point. It's kind of tricky. I think a lot of people at the time did interpret it as infinite regress. That doesn't, I think, necessarily mean that's what Joseph Smith meant. So there's an interpretive point, and then this is kind of the general, like, Latter-day Saints are not super restricted in this area anyway, right? So I think both are live options for Latter-day Saints, and I think Blake has a fairly compelling reading. I'm interested to see Bill Smith has a book coming out on the King Follett discourse, and I'm interested to see what he says about this. Yeah, so you can accept the infinite regress model, or you can accept this idea that our God is a kind of God with a big G, and maybe everyone else is God with little g's. So and there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to both views, and so I'm really not settled on either view. I think Emerson, you did a great job outlining some of the advantages of the infinite regress model. We can make sense of a lot of things that it's hard to make sense of on other models. Especially I think if God has a body, it's kind of nice to think that there could be this evolution step. Very weird to think that God like brutally has this complex body with organs and stuff, if that's the view that you want to take on the monarchical monotheism view. I think there are major advantages, but I think there are advantages in the other direction as well. Like, you've got a much grander God. I think a lot of people think the scriptural data favors the monarchical view. Obviously, it's not like the Old Testament had a conception of God where God had a God, right? But I think there are lots of philosophical things say on both sides. And then for Latter-day Saints, really, there's not much in terms of like statements by leaders that settles it one way or the other. So I think it's nearly a toss-up.
I think it's unfortunate that I think it's unfortunate that there's this from the outside, this noticeable trend of making the Mormon God more and more and more maximalist.
I agree with that.
Less limited. It's like this is part of what made this unique. Like I mean, and it seems like respect to Blake Ostler and everything, but it's like it seems like that's the momentum where it's like pretty soon you're going to end up making the ontological argument. Like 10 generations from now there will be Mormons defending the ontological argument if things like continue in this direction.
So there was a talk recently at a Latter-day Saint philosophy conference where someone tried to say that based on some grounding, this technical term in metaphysics, that you can get like a Mormon Trinity, and so but like in the kind of strict Orthodox sense. And I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of push in the direction of assimilating to this very Hellenized maximal conception of God, and I agree that it's probably
unfortunate.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate. And I think we should. Yes, I agree, and I think that it is. Though I hold to a monarchical monotheism model, I have no problem taken a big fat dump on the Trinity. And, like I do not find like the ontological argument and those other things, like I don't find them compelling in the sense of when you get into the nitty gritty of them. But this is the biggest challenge to the King Follett model, to the infinite regress model, is the scriptures. There's, we get in church every Sunday, we go in and say, "Oh God, the eternal Father," right? It's kind of like, if you're the eternal Father,
right?
But then people have to change the meanings of these words. And I feel like you just get into a lot of scriptural mental gymnastics. And so,
it's messy. Yeah.
And Christians are very right to point out that the scriptures do not easily align with it. And so if there is a move to want to move more towards a monarchical monotheism sort of model, I don't know that it's motivated, at least in my case, it isn't motivated by any, we got to be like the other Christians. It's much more of, how do we square this with the scriptures without engaging in a lot of mental gymnastics? Philosophically, and I think you as a philosopher, Emerson, are right to view that there's a big philosophical appeal to the infinite regress model, especially from a naturalistic perspective, where you're thinking of this as essentially a sort of cosmic evolution that's going on. Yeah. And within Mormon thought, you have sort of the Mormon transhumanists, who are another group you got to talk to, although I have my issues with them. I think there's something to be said for the idea of that you could, in a sense, frame our theology as a great evolutionary process into the cosmos that God is a part of, and that he wants us within this naturally, if you want to broaden natural to whatever all of reality encompasses, he's within that, highly evolved, as it were, and trying to bring us to higher levels of evolution, right? Because at some level of evolution, we direct the course that we'll go. And so from a naturalist perspective, from a philosophical perspective, that can be quite appealing. However, I also think that there's a reason I'm not a transhumanist, in that I think that there are aspects to this, like at least scripturally, it seems pretty clear that things like the infinite regress, they just don't hold a lot of strength, where something like theosis, on the other hand, I think has a great scriptural basis, not only within Latter-day Saint tradition, but I think within the Bible. There's good reason to believe that. And like Orthodox, for instance, get much closer to a Latter-day Saint view of theosis. So to me, like, the scriptures have to be taken into account.
Yeah, for Latter-day Saint, that's gonna be relevant. I think for someone like Emerson, where that's not an issue, I can totally see why the infinite regress model is like, that's awesome.
That was much of a constraint for me. But plus, it's like, scripture is like so underdetermined. I mean, that's part of why I like say that I don't care much about the standard Mormon counter apologetic stuff. Like the CES letter or whatever. Some of those historical things, like, it just seems like, I don't know what to make of it. And then when it comes to like the scriptural things, it's like there are a million ways to interpret scripture. It's hard for me to really lean on that in the same way that Christians of all stripes typically do, because you're really leaning on your own interpretation of scripture, which plenty of smart people disagree with. It just makes more sense to me to rely on these like philosophical reasons that to me seem more solid, rather than like, oh, here's how I read this text. That's like, for me, just personally, that's just not how I'm built.
Sure. Well, I think that there is a problem there when people can get too wild in their interpretations. I tend to hold to the idea that, there are better or worse interpretations, you know what I mean, of text. And so, I still want to account for it, but I agree that Mormonism's strength from a philosophical perspective is often underappreciated. And even from a theological perspective, it's just underappreciated because most people get so caught up in these other CES letter type apologetical battles, which, they have their place. But I'm not a Latter-day Saint because I, looked at the historical case and that's what made it so certain. I'm a Latter-day Saint, I would say, primarily because of the effect that these things have had in my actual life in living the teachings. But on an intellectual level, it's primarily due to the theology. Like, if I believe in God, which I do, and I'm seeking God in the world, I'm trying to find the most plausible theological model that explains what this God is in relation to me and the rest of the cosmos. And interestingly enough, as you pointed out, some people think that Mormonism is the least plausible option out there. And I just think that those people, they don't understand Mormonism. And what I've found is that those who do actually take the time to try and actually understand it, as you've done, they find something that's pretty interesting and compelling. So,
do we have time to talk about Emerson wanting to ask about intelligence, you said, or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the relationship between intelligence and matter. I remember, because I listened to your guys' conversation that you had like maybe a year ago or something on this channel. But yeah, you mentioned something about like the LDS view of matter and how intelligence was an important attribute out of like 4 or something. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have no recollection of what I said at the time, but I mean, yeah, there's some really, I don't know. Orson Pratt is the guy that, so he was one of the first of the 12 apostles under Joseph Smith, so he's very early in the church, and he's our first philosopher, and he's the guy I know best right now in the history of Latter-day Saint thought, because I've written about 100 pages of stuff on what his view in philosophy is so far. I'm going to work through all of the philosophers we have, but he's the one I've done the most work on. And yeah, I mean, so his thought is intelligence in a really robust sense, like agency, intelligence, all that stuff, is present at the fundamental level of reality. And this is partly based on certain motivations he has in responding to Newtonianism, but it's also based on what he takes Joseph Smith to be saying. I think, yeah, the idea that I think we can pretty safely attribute to Joseph Smith the idea that there's there's uncreated stuff, probably autonomous, intelligent. And so what that looks like, it's not clear. I don't think Joseph Smith was super clear. Does he think they're atoms? Does he think that they're like structures of atoms? Does he think it's just like this material but not made up of atoms substance? Because Brigham Young goes on to say that it's unindividuated intelligences; they're not autonomous. It looks like Joseph Smith probably thought that we had like this, almost like souls, but it's all, for him, it's all matter. So yeah, I think for Joseph Smith, intelligence is really quite fundamental in reality. What exactly that looks like, I'm not sure that he had a fully worked out view, but Orson Pratt certainly did, and he was really early on and very influential. But yeah, this idea that like intelligence in a really robust sense is all throughout reality at the most basic level, and he thinks that's the only way we can explain all sorts of phenomena like gravity. He thinks that all causation is agent causation. Yeah, and it's really fun. He's a really fun thinker. But this stuff is very early in the church. You get these really robust claims about what intelligence has to be and where it has to be, if that makes sense.
Well, if you like Orson Pratt, you might like this other guy named Philip Goff, who you should maybe look into. He has a book coming out.
I feel like I need to have him on my channel at some point, because I think you're right that he's got a lot of what he's arguing is really amenable to the Latter-day Saint perspective. We've already done a video on.
Give me a little. I'm not familiar with him. Give me a little bit of a breakdown of what's kind of the basics that he's talking about.
I can direct people to my channel. I don't know when this video will come out, but like I just hosted a debate between Dustin Crummett, who's like a Christian theist, and Philip Goff, who's a panpsychist, on how to best explain psychophysical harmony, and
which is all the rage lately.
And psychophysical harmony, so people just understand what that is. Just to give a quick, let's frame that debate.
It's like a consciousness fine-tuning argument. It sort of says that like our conscious minds have been fine-tuned in a way that is very lucky and fortunate and valuable and ultimately kind of good, and that it was very improbable.
But conscious in the philosopher's technical sense of like phenomenal states, what it's like to experience, right? So I mean, often even our other aspects of our minds, Sure, like, but I think that's what psychophysical harmony emphasizes, the phenomenal states side of it. If I understand.
Yeah. So I have a couple of videos that have been out for a while about this argument, and some people have incorrectly said that Mormons can't use this argument because God is like a physical being or something. And I'll just say, if Mormons can't use the argument, that's not why. But I do think Mormons can use the argument, but it requires God to have some degree of control over the psychophysical laws. So it sort of depends on how you view God's relationship to the laws of nature.
Yeah.
So like, I know that Joseph thinks I believe you take what you read as Joseph Smith's view, which is that God doesn't create the laws of nature. They're just kind of there.
Some of them, at least. Yeah.
Oh, well, see, that's what I was going to say, because maybe you could split your loyalties. Like maybe God doesn't make all of the laws of nature, but maybe he does have some influence over the psychophysical laws, which in practice, that would look like, is it possible for the Mormon God to make philosophical zombies if he so chose? Or would it be possible for the Mormon God to make like inverts? And it's like, it doesn't seem like it's like outside of the bounds of possibility. It seems reasonable to think that the Mormon God could make inverts or zombies or something.
Sure.
So that means that you could attribute psychophysical harmony to, this like cognitive and mental fine tuning to the Mormon God, even though he's a physical being. It's also worth mentioning that what Mormons mean by physical is not exactly what most physicalists mean by physical, which is something I wish I understood better when you and I spoke about panpsychism. But anyway, the point is that there's this consciousness fine-tuning problem, and Philip Goff has this particular way of solving that problem called panagentialism, which is basically what Joseph just described about like intelligence and agency being present in matter, even at the fundamental level. So Philip, kind of outlines this very simple theory where there's basically one principle that guides, the evolution of matter. And from that, you can solve this this cognitive and mental fine-tuning problem. And it also looks a little bit like Orson Pratt's view, and it looks a little bit like so it's like independently in philosophy from this, from this philosopher who's not sympathetic to Mormonism. He's developing this philosophy of nature that looks a lot like what I understand the Mormon view of nature to be. And it also happens to solve, this psychophysical harmony problem. So you could view psychophysical harmony as good evidence for this panagentialist view where like agency and rationality is present in matter fundamentally. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I just find this very interesting. I kind of hinted at it during the debate where I was like, there are some Christians who believe something a lot like this. But I didn't want to say that, like, Philip, you're talking about a limited God and rational matter. You might be
missionaries over.
Have any angels appeared to you recently?
He's like, I'm working on this translation of a book.
So I didn't really specify that because I knew, like, in that I was like, if I say that this is similar to the Mormon view, everybody but me will read that as an insult, even though I mean it, right. Even though I mean it as like a compliment. But no, I just think it's interesting that in philosophy there's this totally independent evidence for something that is like not only the Mormon view, but like something that is very oddly unique, to the Mormon view. Like, that's just kind of exciting to me, because how many people it's like, oh, well, panagentialism, everyone believes in panagentialism. It's no coincidence at all that, so like, if you are attracted to panagentialism, Dustin pointed out, maybe this is evidence for theism in general, because if it is this very, very simple way of bringing about psychophysical harmony, maybe that's just how God chose to do it. Okay, well, obviously you can just have panagentialism without a God. But still, it is interesting that, there seems to be a lot of evidence, as according to Philip, and he has a book coming out called Why, that will be out this year at some point, and it's written for a popular audience and everything. So I would really recommend, people in the LDS Church to read it, because you might find a lot to agree with there. But
Galileo's Era is his popular book that's out already on panpsychism. It's also, I think, worth reading if you're interested in some of the. It's obviously it's not going to cover the same ground that he covers in his new book, but
a little bit of it is in the last chapter, just a tiny bit of it. But this new book is definitely the one to look out for if you're interested in this kind of Orson Pratt sounding view that I've been outlining.
Well, and on that note, so for the listeners who may not be familiar with panpsychism, this is this idea that within matter itself, there's that consciousness is emergent from matter itself. And it does align very nicely with our idea of intelligence and everything being matter and spiritual matter. I think, Joseph, you're right to point out that a lot of this is not fleshed out entirely, but there's also, Joseph, are you familiar with the Skousen model of the atonement? and how that relates to the intelligences. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I don't think so.
I think I might have to send it. I think it was Skousen who did it, but it was along these lines where it was one of the great challenges is to understand the nature of the atonement of Jesus Christ, why it was needed, all of that kind of stuff. And there's a particular model of the atonement that basically states that it had a lot to do with the nature of intelligences and this model of all of creation being minded or having mind within it and agency within it. And that was a massive reason for the need for an atonement. It's an interesting theory, and it's one that I think I'll probably have to send you, Emerson, because I think you would read it and maybe find it really interesting. It's something that I don't know how widely sort of known it is. I know that there are a lot of Latter-day Saints who kind of are aware of this model of the atonement. But I want to send it to you so you can look at it, because as someone with an interest in panpsychism and these things, I think it brings a very unique Latter-day Saint sort of theory of the atonement that makes it make a lot of sense, because the atonement is something on sort of a philosophical level that can actually be very challenging to kind of parse out and sort out within Christianity generally. So anyway, all right, we're pretty much wrapping up here. Any final words, Joseph? I'll let you go first. And any final words?
No, none that I can. I think we've covered good ground. I was going to make a joke and just say a word, but I'm not going to do that.
All righty.
Yeah, there's plenty more to talk about. Like I said, we moved on from the universalism versus different models of hell conversation, but I have a few videos about that, and it's worth unpacking more. But I wasn't even aware we were really going to get into that today, but still, I'm still maintaining that eventually all will be saved if God exists. But yeah.
All right. Well, we'll be there to encourage you to be saved as well the whole way. So, well, hey, Emerson, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate the conversation. If you ever want to do this again sometime, hit me up. I'd be happy to chat. Love to talk about the church. A lot of times I like to bring Joseph along with me if we're going to get into philosophical stuff, because I want to be careful that I don't put my foot in my mouth too much and correct the record. But thanks so much. It's been awesome having you on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I had a really good time.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it. Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I just want to say that I don't think you will find a more serious and rigorous scholar of theology in the church than Blake Ostler.
What Joseph Smith is teaching, as I take it, is what Jesus was teaching in John 14 through 17, this kind of mutual glorification.
Blake is the author of the Exploring Mormon Thought book series and podcast with the same name, which you can find on Spotify or iTunes. Blake is fluent or semi-fluent in 9 languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. He will take any reader or listener on a serious, rational exploration of our theology and doctrine. So be sure to check out his book series, Exploring Mormon Thought, and/or subscribe to his podcast under the same name.